Independence came to over a dozen states peaceably, but in the Belgian Congo, freedom was followed by rioting and army mutiny, a reign of terror and disorder. United Nations troops were called in to avert total chaos. For months, the political pattern kept changing with kaleidoscopic speed until pro-red Premier Lumumba was seized by the forces of strongman Colonel Mobutu. But the struggle for power was far from over.
Patrice Lumumba comes back to Leopoldville a prisoner. The former Congo premier, who was captured when he fled inland, no longer wears the tuft of whiskers on his chin that helped to identify him. His arrest provoked several clashes between Lumumba followers and Congolese army troops.
A new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu. Taken to Mobutu's headquarters past a jeering, threatening crowd, Lumumba was impassive at this lowest ebb of his stormy career. Mobutu watched as his troops manhandled Lumumba.
Temps de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez.
On June 30th, 1960, two speeches echoed across Africa. One praised centuries of bloodshed, brutality, and broken bodies. The other sealed a man's fate. In front of kings, presidents, and the watchful eyes of the whole world, Patrice Lumumba, a tall, defiant young man, stood up and dared to speak a truth that no African leader had ever spoken so boldly before. Patrice Lumumba was born in the heart of the Congo. He had risen from the grinding oppression of Belgian colonial rule to become the first prime minister of an independent Congo. He was Africa's rising hope, a visionary determined to break the chains of foreign domination, a revolutionary who believed that true freedom meant controlling their own destiny, their own wealth, and their own future. But in that single, fiery speech, defying the empire to its face, Lumumba signed his own death warrant. His words shook the halls of Western power. They feared him, they plotted against him, and within months he was brutally silenced forever. They killed the man, but not the idea. This is the story of how a young African leader stared down a king, challenged an empire, and paid the ultimate price, his life. History has tried to bury this story, but today, we are here to dig it back up. Before we understand the power of Patrice Lumumba's words, we must first step back into the nightmare he was born into. In the late 19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium didn't just colonize Congo. He claimed it as his personal property, a massive, brutal plantation the size of Western Europe, ruled by terror, greed, and unimaginable cruelty. Under Leopold's regime, Congo became a human slaughterhouse. Over 10 million Congolese men, women, and children, which was nearly half the population, died during his rule. Villages were brought down to the ground. Men were forced into slavery to harvest rubber. If quotas weren't met, soldiers would chop off the hands of workers, and even their families. Amputated hands became a bizarre currency. Severed limbs presented as proof that bullets hadn't been wasted on animals or rebels. The world eventually heard about these horrors. International outrage forced Belgium's government to seize Congo from Leopold's personal grip in 1908. But don't be fooled. The so-called official Belgian colonial administration was merely a continuation of the same exploitation, just with better paperwork. The Congolese remained second-class beings in their own land. Their labor fueled Belgium's prosperity, while they were barred from basic human rights. No education beyond the bare minimum, no legal recourse, and no hope of advancement. By the 1950s, after 8 decades of colonial rule, less than 20 Congolese people had university degrees. Out of thousands of civil service jobs, Congolese held virtually none. The message was clear. They were good enough to dig Belgium's wealth out of the soil, but never good enough to be a part of it. This was the Congo that Patrice Lumumba grew up in. A Congo that was bleeding under the illusion of civilization, wrapped in the language of progress and benevolence, but hiding the vicious reality of exploitation and death. And so, when King Baudouin took the stage on Independence Day to praise Belgium's civilizing mission, Patrice Lumumba's blood boiled, and history was about to be made. From the shadows of colonial brutality, a flame began to flicker. Patrice Lumumba was born in 1925 in Kasai Province, a place where opportunity was reserved for the colonizer, and survival was the only education most Congolese children received. At the age of 11, Lumumba entered a missionary school. But unlike many who were trained simply to serve, to farm, to clean, and to obey, Lumumba had a hunger that couldn't be tamed. By candlelight, or sometimes with no light at all, he devoured books, questioned everything, and dreamed of something radical: freedom. As a young man, he worked humble jobs, first as a mining assistant and later as a postal clerk. In the segregated cities of the Congo, he saw European luxury and wealth built on African misery. Lumumba was forced to watch his own country through glass windows, being denied entry into hotels, theaters, and even certain streets as a permanent outsider in his own home. But it wasn't enough to be angry. Lumumba found his power through words. He began writing fiery editorials in Congo's few local publications, challenging colonial injustice with a voice that could not be silenced. He surrounded himself with other Congolese intellectuals, men and women who, like him, refused to believe they were destined for servitude. Then, in 1958, Lumumba helped found the Mouvement National Congolais, the MNC inspired by Ghana's successful independence under Kwame Nkrumah. It was the first truly national pan-ethnic movement in Congo's history, a direct challenge to Belgium's strategy of divide and rule. Across the country, the cry for independence grew louder. Protests erupted in the streets of Leopoldville and Stanleyville. Belgian authorities responded with tear gas, bullets, and repression, but the dam had cracked. By 1959, mass riots swept through the streets of Congo. The colonizers, who once believed their rule would last for centuries, suddenly realized they could no longer hold back history with rifles and chains. Under mounting pressure and global embarrassment, Belgium was forced to negotiate. They promised independence, but on their terms. They thought they could still control the future. They hadn't yet reckoned with Patrice Lumumba, the man who stood before a king and demanded freedom, not as a favor, but as a right. June 30th, 1960, Congo's Independence Day. The crowd gathered in Leopoldville. Dignitaries from Belgium, newly appointed African leaders, and the watchful eyes of the world. This was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but the ghosts of colonialism refused to leave the stage quietly.
L'indépendance du Congo constitue l'aboutissement de l'œuvre conçue par le génie du roi Léopold II, entreprise par lui avec un courage tenace et continuée avec persévérance par la Belgique. Lorsque Léopold II a entrepris la grande œuvre qui trouve aujourd'hui son couronnement, il ne s'est pas présenté à vous en conquérant, mais en civilisateur. C'est à vous, messieurs, qu'il appartient maintenant de démontrer que nous avons eu raison de vous faire confiance. Ne compromettez pas l'avenir par des réformes hâtives et ne remplacez pas les organismes que vous remet la Belgique tant que vous n'êtes pas certain de pouvoir faire mieux. Messieurs, le monde entier a les yeux fixés sur vous. Que Dieu protège le Congo.
When King Baudouin of Belgium rose to speak, hope quickly gave way to insult. With chilling calm, King Baudouin praised Belgium's colonial record and glorified one of history's most brutal tyrants. He declared, "The independence of the Congo is the result of the task received by the genius of King Leopold II, a task undertaken with courage and tenacity and furthered by Belgium's own perseverance. Not a word about forced labor, not a word about the mass amputations, not a whisper of the 10 million lives extinguished. Instead, Baudouin suggested that Congo should not change what Leopold had built unless they were certain they could do better. The audacity was staggering. As King Baudouin spoke, Patrice Lumumba sat silently, his jaw tight, his hands scribbling furious notes on scraps of paper. This wasn't just a speech, it was a final act of colonial arrogance, a smug farewell that poured salt into fresh wounds. And Patrice Lumumba was about to answer, not just for himself, but for every Congolese who had ever suffered under the whip. June 30th, 1960. The stage was set, the birth of the Democratic Republic of Congo. With fiery eyes, Lumumba stood up tall, thin, and intense. He marched to the podium, and with no notes, no permission, and no apology, he unleashed a truth that shook the world.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté. La République du Congo a été proclamée et notre cher pays est maintenant entre les mains de ses propres enfants. Ensemble, mes frères, mes sœurs, nous allons commencer une nouvelle lutte, une lutte sublime. Nous avons connu que la loi n'était jamais la même, selon qu'il s'agissait des blancs ou des noirs, accommodante pour les uns, cruelle et inhumaine pour les autres. Nous avons connu les souffrances atroces des relégués pour opinion politique ou croyances religieuses. Exilés dans leur propre patrie, leur sort était vraiment pire que la mort elle-même. Nous avons connu qu'il y avait dans les villes des maisons magnifiques pour les blancs et des paillotes croulantes pour les noirs. Que les noirs n'étaient admis dans les cinémas, ni dans les restaurants, ni dans les magasins européens. Que les noirs voyageaient à même la coque de péniche, au pied du blanc dans sa cabine de luxe. Qui oubliera enfin les fusillades où périrent tant de nos frères? Les cachons furent brutalement jetés, ceux qui ne voulaient plus se soumettre au régime d'injustice, d'oppression et d'exploitation. Cette indépendance du Congo, si elle est proclamée aujourd'hui dans l'entente avec la Belgique, pays ami avec qui nous traitons d'égal à égal, ni les Congolais d'un de ces noms ne pourra jamais oublier cependant que c'est par la lutte qu'elle a été conquise. Une lutte de tous les jours, une lutte ardente et idéaliste, une lutte dans laquelle nous n'avons mélangé ni nos forces, ni nos privations, ni nos souffrances, ni notre sang. Cette lutte qui fit des larmes, des feux et des sangs, nous en sommes fiers jusqu'au plus profond de nous-mêmes, car ce fut une lutte noble et juste, une lutte indispensable pour mettre fin à l'humiliant esclavage qui nous était imposé par la force. Ce qui fit notre sort à 80 ans du régime colonialiste. Nos blessures sont trop fraîches et trop douloureuses encore pour que nous puissions les chasser de notre mémoire. Quand nous avons connu le travail harassant, exiger en échange des salaires qui ne nous permettaient ni de manger à notre faim, ni de nous vêtir ou nous loger décemment, ni d'élever nos enfants comme des êtres chers. Hommage aux combattants de la liberté nationale. Vive l'indépendance et l'unité africaine.
Lumumba's voice thundered, "We have known ironies, insults, and blows morning, noon, and night, because we were Negroes." He spoke of the suffering of his people. He named the crimes the world had tried to forget. He recounted the humiliation, the systemic racism, the beatings, and the dehumanization. And he made it clear, this independence was not a gift. It was a right wrestled from the colonizers by blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Lumumba echoed, "We have fought tirelessly, with tears, fire, and blood, and we are proud of our struggle because it was noble and just." The room split into two worlds, the Congolese crowd. The workers, the farmers, and the mothers erupted in applause. Tears rolled down faces. Fists were raised. Hope had finally found a voice. And the Belgians. The royal officials and the colonial masters sat frozen. Their faces were tight with rage and humiliation. This was not a polite thank you. This was no acceptance of colonial crumbs. This was defiance, raw, righteous, and unstoppable. For the first time, a black African leader stood on the global stage and spoke truth to empire, unbowed and unafraid. And with that speech, Lumumba shattered the fantasy of European benevolence in Africa. Patrice Lumumba had won the hearts of his people, but he had also made enemies that no mere speech could ever silence. The clock had started ticking on his life. Patrice Lumumba's speech was like a lightning bolt, and the shockwaves were immediate. King Baudouin was furious. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. He had come to Congo expecting gratitude, not a public rebuke. In the halls of power, among Belgian elites and colonial sympathizers, humiliation quickly turned into rage. But it wasn't just pride that was wounded. In Washington, London, and Brussels, Lumumba's words triggered something even more dangerous: fear. The Congo wasn't just a forgotten colony. It was a geopolitical goldmine that was rich with copper, diamonds, cobalt, rubber, and most alarmingly, uranium, the primary material for making nuclear weapons. The Cold War became extremely intensive. The West had just watched Cuba fall to communism. They couldn't afford to lose Congo, the heart of Africa, to the Soviet sphere, a dangerous radical. An African Fidel Castro, a man who had to be neutralized by any means necessary. In back rooms from Brussels to Washington, a secret war began. The CIA, under direct orders from President Eisenhower, began plotting Lumumba's removal. The Belgians, who were desperate to protect their mining interests and national pride, offered their full cooperation. Even Britain's MI6 quietly nodded approval. Plans were drawn, agents were mobilized, and covert operations kicked into motion. Since Lumumba couldn't be controlled, he was destroyed. What terrified the West wasn't that Lumumba had declared himself a communist. He hadn't. What terrified them was something even worse: an African leader who refused to bow, an African nation daring to dream of true independence, political, economic, and psychological. From that moment, the world's most powerful forces, Belgium, Britain, and the CYA, worked together to silence him. And the clock was ticking. Patrice Lumumba's crime wasn't just speaking the truth. His real crime was refusing to kneel. In Washington, London, and Brussels, fear turned to panic. The Congo, a nation blessed with copper, uranium, cobalt, and diamonds, was slipping beyond their grasp. And in the fevered mind of Cold War strategists, anything outside their control must belong to the Soviets. In 1960, declassified CIA cables revealed the unbelievable truth. President Dwight D. Eisenhower personally authorized Lumumba's assassination. The CIA dispatched its top scientist with a poison kit, a biological weapon that was designed to mimic a tropical disease. The plan was to slip the toxin into Lumumba's toothpaste, or his food. Anything to silence him, as long as it couldn't be traced back to the United States. When poison failed, political sabotage began. The CIA poured money into Joseph Mobutu, a young, ambitious army colonel. Mobutu became their man on the inside, bribing soldiers, securing loyalty, plotting Lumumba's downfall. At the same time, Belgium wasn't sitting idle. With direct backing from Brussels and Belgian mining companies, the Katanga province, rich in minerals, seceded from Congo. It was a move that was designed to fracture the new nation and keep the wealth flowing into European pockets. Patrice Lumumba turned to the United Nations, pleading for help. He demanded they protect Congo's sovereignty, stop Belgian troops, and reunite the country. But the United Nations, being under pressure from Washington and Brussels, refused to intervene. Instead, they stood by, paralyzed by diplomacy, while Congo collapsed into chaos, isolated and betrayed, surrounded by enemies foreign and domestic. Patrice Lumumba, who was once the symbol of African freedom, was now marked for death, abandoned by the very institutions that claimed to defend liberty. And the final trap was closing fast. By late 1960, Patrice Lumumba was a marked man. Stripped of power, betrayed by his own army, and abandoned by the United Nations, Lumumba was placed under house arrest in the capital city of Leopoldville, a gilded cage surrounded by layers of Congolese soldiers who were loyal to Mobutu and watched silently by United Nations troops. But Lumumba, ever the fighter, refused to go quietly. On November 25, 1960, during a torrential rainstorm, hidden in the back of a car, he slipped past his captors. After just a few days on the run, Congolese soldiers captured him. Patrice Lumumba, the man who had dared to dream of a free Africa, was dragged from the bush, battered and humiliated. He was now a prisoner of his enemies. His ordeal was just beginning. First came the savage beatings, then the secret phone calls to Mobutu and Belgian officials. What do we do with him? Mobutu's regime and their Belgian backers knew one thing: Lumumba must not live. He was too powerful being alive. His words, even in chains, could still ignite a nation. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba, along with 2 loyal comrades, was flown to Katanga, the mineral-rich breakaway province controlled by Belgian mercenaries and Mobutu's allies. The moment the plane touched down, a death squad was already waiting. In a remote clearing deep in the Katangan wilderness, Lumumba and his companions were savagely beaten one final time. Then, under the cover of darkness, they were shot by a firing squad. Then their bodies were dumped unceremoniously into shallow graves. But the murderers weren't done. Belgian officers returned, terrified that the bodies could become martyrs. They dug up the corpses, dismembered them with hacksaws, and dissolved the remains in sulfuric acid. For weeks, the world asked, "Where is Patrice Lumumba?" Lies circulated that he had escaped, that he had been lynched by villagers. But when the truth emerged, it triggered global outrage. Throughout Africa, Lumumba's death became a searing wound and a burning call for true liberation. And yet the Western world, the so-called champions of freedom, turned away. Same powers that spoke of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law had silently condoned the brutal silencing of Africa's brightest voice. History will one day have its say, not the history written by Brussels, Paris, or Washington, but by the free sons and daughters of Africa. Patrice Lumumba, final letter to his wife. They thought they could kill a man and bury his dreams with him. But they were wrong. Patrice Lumumba's life was cut brutally short. At just 35 years old, he was beaten, humiliated, shot, and dissolved into nothing. His body erased, as if history itself could be rewritten. But you see, ideas cannot be dissolved, truth cannot be buried, and the voice of a people will always rise again. Across Africa, Lumumba's name became a rallying cry for liberation. From Ghana to Algeria, from South Africa to Angola, he stood as a towering symbol of resistance against colonial greed, Western domination, and racial injustice. He taught the world something powerful. Telling the truth to power is dangerous, but it is also the first step toward freedom. Even today, decades later, Lumumba's spirit breathes through every struggle for dignity, equality, and self-determination. He is honored not because he ruled long or amassed riches, but because he dared to believe that an African nation could be truly free. And though they tried to silence him, his final message echoes louder with every generation. That freedom is not given, it is won. Patrice Lumumba's life reminds us that you can kill the revolutionary, you can destroy his body, you can desecrate his memory, but you can never kill the dream of a free people. They killed the man, but not the idea. If Lumumba's voice moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Join the freedom movement by subscribing to this channel, so the world never forgets the price of truth and the cost of freedom.